e a apresentação dos Keynote 2. Nesse momento, damos início à atração cultural com a banda de trombones, chamada Potibones, da Escola de Música da Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Norte.
Você captou? Bom dia. Bom dia. Então, esse é um grupo de locutores, um grupo de extensão da Escola de Música da UFRN. Nós já estamos na batalha dessa formação desde 2008, fazendo música brasileira, música nordestina, compositores rio-grandenses também. O objetivo central do grupo é fazer música da nossa região, do Nordeste e do Rio Grande do Norte. Essa primeira música se chama Se Você Vai, Eu Vou, da compositora, cantora, instrumentista, multi-instrumentista, Luci Alves, que eu conheço, a atriz, caminhando aí, nosso caso. Então, Luci Alves paraibano, e com arranjo de Juscelino Coelho. Nosso grupo está sentado, ligado à Escola de Música da UFRN, e estamos abertos ao público, no geral, a qualquer ocasião que vocês queiram contratar ou convidar. Tá? Então, qualquer coisa, sigam também nas redes sociais, @blogcontesoficial, tá? Lá, Instagram, quem quiser tirar foto, filmar, gosta de siga no blogcontes, ok? A gente agradece. Então vamos tocar agora um choro chamado Um Trombonista Romântico. Para quem não sabe, nós todos somos trombones, né? Trombones tenor, esse aqui do trombone mais grave, do trombone baixo. E nós tocamos, como nós tocamos música brasileira, nada mais do que tocar com o complemento da bateria. Então nós temos aqui com a bateria Renan Barros, nosso baterista. Uma salva de palmas para Renan. Aqui no lado esquerdo tem na S, na 6. E o bateria Tiago Vicente. Esse nome mais estranho, né? Melquisedeque Gomes. É o nome bíblico, né? Melquisedeque é o nome bíblico. E eu, Gilvano, azeitona do trombone. Sim, a composição do trombonista romântico é de Carlos Lima e Espírito Santo, com arranjo de Juscelino Coelho. Vai encerrar a participação. Vamos tocar mais uma música do grupo agora, no princípio também. Genival Lacerda. No princípio, eu vejo a Sereia Xixi, com a arranjo de Pedro e Augusto. Obrigado e um bom evento para vocês.
Agradecemos ao grupo Potibones pela belíssima apresentação. Dando seguimento à nossa conferência de encerramento, gostaríamos de convidar a professora Diana Vidal, da Universidade de São Paulo, para mediar a conferência. Gostaríamos de convidar nossos ilustres conferencistas de hoje, que apresentam uma perspectiva única sobre as temáticas centrais da nossa conferência. Professor Pierre Guidi, e a professora Zandra Pedraza. Passo agora a palavra para a professora Diana.
Bom dia a todos, bom dia a todas. É uma alegria estar aqui com vocês nesse encerramento e ver essa sala cheia assim, de tantas pessoas queridas, né, que vieram de vários lugares do mundo para estar aqui na nossa Natal, no nosso Brasil. É com muita alegria que eu recebo essa incumbência, né, de apresentar os 2 keynotes dessa manhã, que vão fazer a conferência de encerramento do nosso 45º ISCHE. Então, a professora Zandra Pedraza, da Universidade de Los Andes, Colômbia, e o professor Pierre Guidi, da Université Paris-Cité, da França. Cada um de vocês terá em torno de 30 minutos para fazer a exposição, e começaremos com a professora Zandra, primeiro as damas, depois o professor Pierre, e na sequência, então, teremos a cerimônia de encerramento do evento. Então, passo a palavra à professora Zandra.
Hello. Buenos dias. You can see me. Você me ouve, me vê. Muito obrigada às pessoas da universidade, a professora Olívia Medeiros Neto, a Inês Dussel, a Laia e a todas as autoridades da universidade por esta invitação. Sou honrada, muito feliz de estar aqui. Good morning, everybody. I was giving thanks to all authorities at the university, at Professor Inês Dussel, at Professor Olivia Medeiros Neto, a Laia, and all the people who made this possible. I'm honored and very glad to be here with you. So, as Inés told me, I had to read this in English. I was a little bit troubled. So I must recognize here that this text has been possible with the help of at least 4 artificial intelligences. So in mine, I hope it's not lost in all this text. So to the point, in a minor key, coloniality in the Colombian Republican education. I will address today a set of practices and ideas about education that have been embedded in educational experiences and representations over several decades after the independence of Colombia. I approach them as a cultural and political mechanism that reproduce coloniality in a minor key, with an unstated goal that, however, entangled coloniality in the Republican social order. Because coloniality is a form of power operating with others that does not function by itself, it should not be analytically isolated because it may not always be a dominant key, but it articulates itself strategically with other powers. In Colombia, as in many Latin American countries, the construction of the national, republican, and post-colonial state in the first decades of the 19th century was ambitious and complex. Culturally and politically, it involved educating people on the principles of republican citizenship, forging a sense of national identity, and shaping national autonomy. In social and economic terms, the urgent need was to move away from colonial differences and inequalities and to strengthen liberal principles. Efforts were made in various social spheres. The school, of course, was a privileged place. In a minor tone, other educational processes nuanced the republican goals of post-colonial education. One is what I name as la educación de las mujeres, women's education, an ideal combination of activities and attitudes that flourished in the post-colonial republic and aim at placing women, men, and children in new positions and relationships. The second process involves one of the goals females should achieve, the education of modern childhood. In this, some of the tensions of modernity coloniality become apparent. As an analytical concept, women's education aimed to consolidate social, cultural, and political change as part of the construction of a republican nation. I would like to address the complex game that is involved in trying to achieve the goals inherent in republicanism, such as the formation of the liberal citizen, while at the same time reinforcing social differences in the post-colonial order. I will take it here, it's better. Okay, after referring to some highlights of the post-colonial project of modeling modern women, I will discuss how the disposition of modern childhood entangles coloniality in women's education. In the 19th century, there were no significant debates about the legal and social framework for the position of women in Colombia. The principle of an unbridgeable difference between the sexes that supported the gender inequality inherent in the Declaration of the Rights of Man was uncritically adopted, assuming the bourgeois family model as the core of society and promoting corresponding family duties. Although the bourgeois family did not quickly and not at all become the primary form of social organization in the country, various social actors made notable efforts to promote it with important support from the Catholic Church, especially in aspects of family education management. Before independence, in the last decades of the 18th century, the women's question in Hispanic America had been addressed primarily by doctors and moralists who published and translated extensive texts on the importance of home education. In contrast, women's education, while emerging as an imprecise, broad set of activities, was crucial to the formation of female republican identity through home economics, child-rearing, modern marriage, and social service. In fact, the transition to republican constitutions in Hispanic America entailed the acceptance of women's legal subordination, but also a change in their education aimed at the cultural transformation of their lives and society. There was a growing expectation that Republican women would abandon the pious seclusion of colonial life, adopt modern household management, and transform their roles and influence in public life. In this way, the home would become a place of connection with the public world, and the household the basis for the production of national wealth. The housewife's duties, while demonstrating her legal and social subordination, also emphasized her unique role within the growing capitalist economy. The scientific organization of domestic work conceived home economics as modern knowledge, marking a reorientation of women's daily activities towards a more complex understanding of their role within the Republic. females' education became a pedagogical tool for the reordering the sexual division of labor. It was instrumental in consolidating the nation-state in its governance practices, including the relation between family and school. By the conclusion of the Hispanic American colonial period, it had become evident that if liberal and republican ideas were to gain ground, the education of women would have to undergo a substantial transformation. Until that time, educational establishment in Nueva Granada adhered to the principles set forth in 1783 by, for example, La Enseñanza, a model institution that placed an emphasis on moral education and prepared girls and young Criollo women for a life of seclusion. Following the attainment of independence in 1821, a new focus emerged regarding the role of women in the post-colonial economic and social context. In 1832, establishments like the Colegio de la Merced, a Republican institution, aimed to educate women in matters pertaining to the domestic sphere. However, this modern home appears distinct from the colonial one, as it is situated within the context of public civil life. It sought to prepare women to fulfill their natural destinies in this new context by molding children into citizens and establishing emotionally and economically modern homes. The displacement of women's position was driven by a number of factors, including the cultural and political necessity to educate children for citizenship. This involved the introduction of control and norms derived from disciplines such as hygiene, pedagogy, and scientific administration. Her education was intended to make a Republican housekeeper, mother, and wife capable of guiding the morality dubious inclinations of men, managing the household economy, and inculcating religious and patriotic guidelines in her children, besides technical skills. Even projects aimed at working women, such as Las Marías, created by the Círculo de Obreros de la Acción Social Católica, a Catholic organization for laborers, combined ideas of saving, living in poverty, and devotion to work with a way of being that still emphasized chastity, obedience, piety, and meekness. Nevertheless, these virtues were not intended to segregate women from public life. Rather, they were designed to equip them with the skills necessary to assume roles as active workers, domestic servants, and modern laborers. This entailed managing household finances, domestic responsibilities, and achieving economic autonomy even in the absence of marriage. In the 1930s, the topic of women's education became a significant point of contention, particularly in liberal governments, as liberal governments began to advocate for women's access to secondary and higher education. Those with conservative views, including many women, argued that female education beyond the primary level was unnecessary. In contrast, those with progressive views advocated for women's university education, participation in public life, leadership in social and welfare roles, and involvement in the scientific fields. Despite differing views, all parties agreed to preserve the core of women's education established in the 19th century, which focused on their roles as housewives, mothers, and marriage. Until the 1950s, the corpus of knowledge of women's education was further disseminated through various media, including the press, magazines, and radio, and even as a college programs for women that began in the 1930s and followed up to the 40s and 50s. The Republican education of women had multiple functions. From a moral standpoint, it ensured the bond between family and nation, regulated the sexuality of couples and children, and guaranteed the social reproduction of the heterosexual order. From a political perspective, it served to legitimize differences and subordination in citizenship based on gender and age, while simultaneously reinforcing the bourgeois family as the social nucleus. The domestic economy posited that modern femininity is contingent upon the efficient management of the home. As administrators of this initiative, women assume an active role in national economic development. Furthermore, this education addressed the social distinctions between middle and upper-class women and workers. The former, particularly the more affluent women, had a social and Catholic obligation towards the latter. A closer examination of women's role as educators reveals the varying objectives associated with this responsibility. The education of elite women as mothers and social workers illustrate how a second layer of differentiation may emerge from the first. Women as mothers in a modern colonial country. The development of modern perspectives on childhood in Colombia, as elsewhere, especially since the late 19th century, has been influenced by national and transnational trends. This evolution was not strictly aligned with the dominant national political ideologies of the time, liberal and conservative, because it was shaped by two other forces. The first was the broad international process of modernization, which included changes in discourses and social norms related to work, family, and gender roles. The second force, a regional one, was the growing emphasis on education to develop productive and civilized nations. This dynamic involved social reformers and government officials in proposing, translating, and implementing modern ideas about education in the intersection of family and school. The persistence of coloniality as a pattern of power after independence led former colonial elites, the criollos, to utilize colonial racial and social classifications to characterize national populations while also promoting civil rights. This ideological pattern employed subordination principles in the nations to establish democratic and republican social distinctions. Family education became a pivotal aspect as it integrated contemporary notions about childhood and family dynamics, suggesting a novel ontology for children that implied new family arrangements. In the 20th century, governments increasingly prioritized family and education. There was also growing awareness of the necessity to educate the children of subordinate families, be they workers, impoverished, abandoned, or delinquent. As cultural mediators, national elites facilitated the adaptation to local contexts of contemporary notions of modern childhood and parenthood in its emotional scope, acting as hinges that allowed for the integration of these ideas into different cultural settings. However, what could be considered modern about emotional education? The modern subject engaged in self-reflection and seeks to alter their approach to life and emotional expression. The particular bourgeoisie's interest in the self grew during the 19th century in pursuit of personal development and the cultivation of one's character. Among an expanding array of social groups, this aspiration became a fundamental aspect of children's education. As the scope of schooling expanded, there was a corresponding increase in social expectation regarding the influence that adults could exert on children's character. The family unit, particularly the parents, were the primary agents in this process. In contrast to the patriarchal and Catholic upbringing that was prevalent during the 19th century, this modern education was also oriented towards the strengthening of individuality and personality traits such as personal effort and self-interest. The view of children and women as blind and fearful of obedience towards men was to be replaced by a more nuanced understanding of their relationships, characterized by affective bonds, dialogue, reasoning, and mutual consent. The role of the modern mother was redefined to encompass new emotional responsibilities, which she was expected to apply in her domestic and familiar relationships. A key aspect of this cultural and educational project was the transformation of the prevailing emotional landscape within the educational sector. This was undertaken with the objective of establishing a more conducive emotional environment aligned with a pedagogical model of long-term development that would facilitate the growth of children's individuality. If the nation aspired to enhance educational standards and national character, Children were to be exposed to a contemporary approach to learning and to develop a sense of self that would enable them to embody civic values, citizenship, and progress. During the initial decades of the 20th century, the emotional environment within the domestic and educational spheres underwent a transformation, facilitating the emergence and propagation of affections that had previously been relatively underrepresented. Norbert Elias directly addressed the historicity of adult-child relationships, stressing that an affective tenor had permeated their bones as the civilizing process advanced. The civilizing of parents is part of the long and gradual Western civilizing process that involved a change in the affective environment of interpersonal relationships so that children gain autonomy and develop complex abilities to act in the world, which defies the emotional relationships between adults and children. A modern emotional education signifies that those bonds evolved slowly into more egalitarian and affectionate, loving ones. This happened because society became more sensitive towards childhood and slowly accepted that it deserved differentiated treatment. The purpose of modernizing emotional education implies the recognition that affective practices influence relationships and the different affective practices could change the outcome of education by producing modern subjects. In the early 20th century, the engagement of elite was driven by their philanthropic interest in social welfare, which fostered their sensibility to social differences. However, their moral and emotional disposition was not aimed at eliminating these differences for all infants. Modern emotional education was a purpose for their sons and daughters. For other children, they envisioned future moral and productive adults rather than happy infants. From a colonial perspective, this sensitivity addressed the difference among children in accordance with societal views of their differentiated educational needs. In order to gain insight into how women conceptualize their role as educators, I selected a Colombian women's magazine and focused on its interest in home education between the years 1926 and 1940. The parenting practices observed reflect the conservative ideology of the elite woman of Antioquia, a prosperous and rapidly industrializing state, while also incorporating a modern sensitivity toward childhood. This sensitivity served to differentiate the needs of children from middle and upper class backgrounds from those of lower classes. I will highlight the role of the elite as cultural mediators, as they integrated transnational perspective on childhoods, family, and education with local conditions, mostly downplaying cultural, racial, and ethnic differences. In addition, the debates over women's citizenship during this period, fueled by liberal reforms, saw women writers supporting liberal women's rights while reinforcing conservative values in child-rearing. This paradoxical stance shows how sensitivity to social differences also perpetuated activities that reproduced those differences. From the early 20th centuries, Colombians participated in regional and international meetings on social issues, engaging intellectual, political, and social circuits that promote social change. Government officials and some women representatives of elite groups and feminine organizations advocated for social agendas leading to laws and interventions that should reinforce modern childhoods. Both men and women played key roles in disseminating these. The modern colonial condition meant that many children continued to develop under the influence of colonial structures and practices in the post-independence era. As middle and upper-class children pursued a bourgeois lifestyle in urban centers, new ideas and practices regarding childhood began to emerge. However, these ideas and interventions frequently resulted in the stigmatization of indigenous, rural, and popular understandings of age and growth. The Colombian magazine Letras y Encajes from Medellín, capital city of Antioquia, provides an illustrative example of the modern colonial perspective of elite local women. The magazine reflects bourgeois ideals and the complex path of middle and upper-class women towards emancipation. However, the magazine's discussions on childhood also reveal differentiated pathways for elite and popular children, influenced by the privileges of woman proximity to modern childhood concepts. While modern ideas guided elite parents' child-rearing practices, social programs conceived by elite women introduce modern colonial patterns that reinforce subordinations. Letras y Encajes, a magazine for modern women. I quote from an issue of 1939. The modern woman is no longer a housekeeper. She must undergo scientific training to work as a mother who places her children in the country and society. The emergence of modern femininity in Latin America, particularly among upper-class women, is characterized by a blend of traditional domestic roles and a burgeoning sense of citizenship and rights. Studies have shown that in the period leading up to the full recognition of women's civil rights, domestic and maternal duties were central to their identities. In this cultural context, a group of well-off and social-sensitive women launched this magazine in August 1926, reflecting their engagement in the debates around women's rights and the modernization of family and education, as well as their intention to support welfare. Letras y Encajes became Colombia's longest-lasting women's magazine of the 20th century, surviving significant social and political changes. It started amidst Colombia's transition from conservative to liberal governments, which promoted legal and social reforms. By 1945, women were constitutionally recognized as citizens. The changes introduced in the magazine's subtitle, from a monthly magazine to an illustrated magazine, and later a ladies' magazine, mirrored its increasing involvement in these debates. Key legislative changes during this period included a new patrimonial regime in marriage in 1932, equal civil rights for women in 1957, and shared parental authority in 1968, all of which were discussed in Letras y Encajes. The magazine was also intended to satisfy the intellectual, social, artistic, and moral interest of elite women. Its contributors, men and women, including regular authors and guest writers, addressed the implications of these reforms for family education and the role of modern women in societal changes. Family education, as promoted by these women, involved transforming their family relation to more horizontal and emotional sensitive, modernizing children's education, and enlightening women with scientific and academic knowledge while upholding Christian charity. They did not intend to challenge conservative sex differences, but rather to promote women's civil rights and modern family values within a Catholic moral framework. They sought to balance family relationships with increasing demands for children to become modern subjects and productive citizens. When involved in social welfare, they differentiated education guidelines for upper-class children and subordinated. These women, educated abroad and connected with prominent figures and international circuits, contributed to this discourse. The magazine featured original, reprinted, or translated text with regular sections written by women, and there was a constant exchange of ideas with women's magazines in other regional countries. Letras y Encajes excelled as a local journal committed to transnational ideas and practices. In its first 15 years, it laid the foundation for these discussions, later becoming more critical in its demands for women's legal equality and supporting the suffrage movement. Scholars recognize the magazine as a crucial source for understanding women's rights and feminist movements in Colombia. However, it has not been thoroughly analyzed regarding parent-child relations as a central aspect of this modern colonial family project. During the 19th century, children's education became a major focus for societies. There was an expansion of ideas about what happens as children grow. Due to these emerging concerns about the nature of childhood, society saw the need to remove children from the labor force and develop a public schooling system. Countries following a path of social progress based on economic growth and capitalist development were interested in building public education systems and even pursuing compulsory education. The dissemination of the Geneva Declaration of the Rights of the Child's Rights in 1924 heightened in Colombia awareness of childhood, yet it underscored the modern colonial perspective that defined children's nature. The moral and emotional modulation of rights for middle and upper class children and the encouragement of responsibility towards subordinate education contrasted with the informants of the Declaration, which became the guide for family education for subordinate children, while compulsory and free public education was not a priority. Two other major concerns shaped Colombian elites' approach to education. Two other major concerns shaped Colombian elites' approach to educating subordinate children: the fear of race degeneration and the influence of eugenics, which framed social projects until 1940. 10 years before, Mrs. Quevedo de Kock, one regular member of the writers, emphasized the importance of educating the lower classes for societal benefit, linking heredity, environment, and education. I quote, "By approaching the lower classes and trying to favor and instruct them, the upper classes do as much for themselves as for their beneficiaries. Only an active education will lead our young and intelligent people to the advantages of other civilizations and races. In the formation of the individual, heredity, environment, and education converge." From this perspective, elite women should display their responsibilities towards the lower classes. Modern pedagogy, I quote again, had to act between material and ideal conditions for children to develop normally in material and spiritual matters. But needed families encountered pitfalls. How can they do it? The child will go to the street and fall into crime. There are also diseases, tuberculosis, and child labor. It is necessary to build love so that childhood is the foundation of society. La Asociación General de Mujeres Colombianas para la Acción Cultural, endorsed by Ministry of Education, exemplifies the elite-subordinate relationship that was reinforced from the former view. The minister urged elite women to support rural children education, seeing them as vital to the nation's renewal. Women's associations and charity groups developed a sense of duty toward these children, embodying virtues like sweetness, sacrifice, nobility, or spirituality. Letras y Encajes often described social institutions abroad, mainly in Europe, after one of the women writers visiting them, or local initiatives like las escuelas populares to provide education to disadvantaged children. This initiative aimed to adapt to workers' needs by creating homeschools and teaching the whole family together. The magazine's social and charitable activities focus on the children of Medellin and Antioquia, addressing the need of lower-class children. For elite children, the aim was to develop character, leadership, and citizenship, combining expertise in modern childhood knowledge with Christian values. For poor and orphan children, Letras y Encajes supported projects in line with the Declaration of the Rights of the Child, emphasizing Christian charity to civilize them, basic literacy, but not promoting modern emotional relationships. I think Letras y Encajes reflects the complex interplay of modern and colonial perspectives on childhood education and social responsibility in the early 20th century. It reveals how elite women concealed their roles within a framework of traditional values and modern aspirations, shaping the educational landscape for both privileged and disadvantaged children. The magazine stands as a witness to the era's evolving social consciousness and the enduring impact of colonial legacies on modern practices. Within the Colombian and Latin American context of modern colonial relations, a local publication helps us understand that modern but differentiated childhoods were part of a broader social changes initiated by regional republics in the 19th century. Modern childhoods emerge alongside modern families, relationships, and subjectivities, partially connected to central and hegemonic representations. Elites acted as cultural mediators, integrating in a minor key local projects and legal system with northern representations and experiences, and promoted mainly well-intended values and policies that perpetuated colonial differences, making the coloniality of power a tangible experience embedded and naturalized in daily family lives. I hope exhibiting this cultural mechanism within the modern colonial assembly might illuminate the contemporary debates about decolonization. Obrigada.
Agradeço a Zandra por todo esse panorama interessantíssimo dos anos 20, do início do século 20, e sobre a educação e como que a educação feminina modelou, né, os valores tradicionais e as práticas modernas modelaram essa educação da infância, tanto das classes mais privilegiadas quanto das classes mais desfavorecidas. De fato, a gente teve um panorama bastante intenso e muito bacana para pensar os movimentos atuais na Colômbia. E eu convido imediatamente o professor Pierre para fazer a sua intervenção.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It is an honor for me to be here, and I want to thank ISCHE Executive Committee and the Organization Committee here in Natal and Brazil to give me this opportunity, which is the first in my career. I want to thank also the team of colleagues and students, the one with the black t-shirt, who facilitated everything for us, and they make things very easy, very smooth, and very friendly. Thank you very much. And I want also to thank the colleagues who are preparing the coffee and the food for the coffee break, which is, we can't think without eating, I think. So thank you very much. So my paper is titled Addressing Ambiguity, African Educators Confronted with Colonization, 1880s, 1950s. How have African pedagogues used educational institutions as a field of negotiation and struggle to build spaces of autonomy under colonization? What tactical uses did they make from their position at the interface of imperial powers and African societies? What kinds of responses did their pedagogies seek to provide to the multiple domination in which they lived? To provide some answers to these broad questions, I use three examples from three distinct contexts. The first is Edward Wilmot Blyden, director of Liberia College in Liberia, West Africa. He proposed an educational program published in 1881 under the title Aims and Method of a Liberal Education for Africans. Liberia was an independent country whose settlers were freed slaves from the Caribbean and the US. Blyden conceived his educational program at the dawn of the conquest of Africa by European imperial powers. The second example is a network of East African teachers trained at Maseno School, an institution established in 1906 by the Church Missionary Society. In the 1920s and 30s, they produced a vast body of literature in a variety of local languages, which they conceived as a pedagogical and political work in a context of hardening colonial segregationist systems in Southern and East Africa. The third example is Sennedu Gebru, an Ethiopian woman pedagogue. She was the director in the 1940s and 50s of the Ethiopian elite girls' school. In her view, a balanced education between Ethiopian and European knowledge, as well as a similar academic knowledge for women and men, was central to Ethiopia's independence and future. Independent Ethiopia, just liberated from 5 years of Italian occupation, was nevertheless under strong British and US influence. What these pedagogues have in common is that they received high-level education in missionary or European institutions. They were teachers or principals in key school institutions whose objectives they sought to reorient. They were aware that schools were social spaces where the objective of the colonizers and the colonized met, mingled, and confronted each other. They understood that school education could be a site of power, struggle, and negotiations. Ambiguity, which is in my title. According to the French language dictionary Petit Robert, I quote, ambiguity, which unites two opposite qualities, which participate in two different natures. Or ambiguity, I quote again, ill-defined, which seems to participate in contrary nature and call for contradictory judgments. Opposite, different, contrary, contradictory. The notion of ambiguity is understood within binary systems that relate opposites. And post-colonial studies have clearly demonstrated how colonization was based on binary opposition, stemming from the fundamental racial division that hierarchized colonizers and colonized. For its part, social history has highlighted the negotiating skills of colonized population in the face of colonial violence, their defense of autonomous spaces, the creative appropriations they demonstrated. Colonial education reflects both those aspects. On the one hand, it was meant to inculcate in pupils the validity of racial hierarchies and turning them into docile workers in the colonial system. On the other hand, as an ideological apparatus, school education was more amenable to negotiation or conflict than repressive apparatuses which operated with raw violence. It is by virtue of this double aspect that school education was a key site of colonial confrontation and its ambiguities. Colonized teachers were at the heart of this confrontation. In his novel, L'Aventure ambiguë, The Ambiguous Adventure, the Senegalese writer Cheikh Hamidou Kane tackles the question of ambiguity as a lived experience for Africans who went to colonial schools. It deals with the difficulty for the same individual of carrying cultural systems that are sometimes irreconcilable. How can they be made to cohabit when dialogue is impossible, even though both are considered valid? Therein lies the ambiguity, which leads to the pain of being left in an in-between state. The pedagogues discussed here have addressed this ambiguous position. They used their middle position to recompose the knowledge and know-how at their disposal in order to create resources for resistance. These pedagogues had both a close and distant relationship with the order of knowledge imposed by the Europeans. This knowledge inferiorized Africans and their knowledge, but it could be also a resource in colonial context. I already said too much for an introduction, so who were the pedagogues I propose to introduce? What did they propose in concrete terms? And what avenues for research can we draw from their experiences? Edward Wilmot Blyden was born in 1832 on the island of St. Thomas in the Caribbean. He was the son of freed slave parents. A promising student, he tried his luck in the US. But because of his skin color, theological seminaries turned him down. He then approached the American Colonization Society, whose aim was the return of freed American slaves to Africa through the colonization of Liberia. In true missionary spirit, the American Colonization Society relied on these former slaves to evangelize Africa. Blyden went to Liberia in 1850 at the age of 18, and he spent all of his life there almost. He found the Liberian society segregated between American Liberians, the free slaves who had crossed the Atlantic, and Africans. The American Liberians were a coastal society looking towards Europe and the Americas rather than toward the interior, whose societies they despised. Blyden opposed this state of affairs. A pioneer of Pan-Africanism, he believed in the unity of all black people on both sides of the Atlantic to free themselves together from white domination. Therefore, Blyden's pedagogical action was part of a twofold struggle against white supremacy over blacks and against the colonial situation in Liberia, where American Liberians dominated Africans. As principal of Liberia College, Blyden detailed his educational program in his inaugural address in 1880, titled Aims and Methods of Liberal Education for Africans. What was his program? Witnessing the harmful effects of the education received by blacks in the US, Blyden began by saying that imitation should be avoided at all costs. I quote, "They attempt to copy and imitate them and share the fate of all copyists and imitators. Bound to move on a lower level, they acquire and retain a practical inferiority. They often receive direct teachings which are not only incompatible with, but destroying of their self-respect." Under these conditions, what kind of education was needed to ensure that black people became subject of knowledge in their own rights? First, they had to reappropriate the writings of ancient Greece and Rome. For Blyden, these writings were the best in the intellectual history of humankind. Africans had to study them in their original languages, stripped of commentaries and translation in European languages. Africans could read these works without any harm because in the Greek, and I quote, "In the Greek and Latin literature, there is not, as far as I know, a sentence, a word, or a syllable disparaging the Negro. He may get nourishment from them without taking any race poison. They will perform no sinister work on his consciousness." For Blyden, ancient wisdom was universal, not the preserve of Europeans. Jack Guidi, 100 years before the theft of history. Indeed, Blyden liked to point out that according to Herodotus, the Egyptians who had so influenced the Greeks had black skin and woolly hair. This brings to the second point. Blyden argued that the entire body of European literature produced from the Atlantic slave trade should be excluded from study. It was from this point of history that knowledge had become impregnated with the idea of the natural inferiority of blacks. I quote, the transatlantic slave trade arose and theories were invented for the degradation and proscription of the Negro. This epoch continues to this day and has an abundant literature and prolific authorship. It has produced that whole tribe of declamatory negrophobists whose views, in spite of their emptiness and impertinence, are having their effect upon the ephemeral literature of the day, a literature which is shaping the life of the Negro in Christian lands. By Christian lands, Blyden meant, of course, Europe and the Americas. Third, in agreement with the American Colonization Society, Blyden believed that Christianity, whose vocation was universal, would be a blessing for Africa and the unity of black peoples. But Europeans, by forcibly subjugating other people in the name of Christianity, betrayed its message. This is why black people had to reappropriate Christianity, bypassing the mediation of the Europeans and going straight to the text, I quote, without note or comment. Fourth point, the educational program was to include the teaching of the languages, legal codes, form of political organization, and techniques of the African societies in the interior. These societies had created the knowledge and know-how best suited to life on the African continent. In short, the knowledge that Blyden wanted to teach aimed to establish a new epistemology. Through the cross-fertilization of local African knowledge and reappropriated Greco-Latin and biblical knowledge, education at Liberia College was to create a universal African knowledge. Blyden believed in equality in difference. He was imbued with a vision, widely shared in the 19th century, according to which humanity was divided into races, each with its own genius, which should be developed through education to benefit all humankind. But Blyden was not really able to fully implement his program. First, for lack of funds. Secondly, because his position was difficult to maintain. The American colonization society in the US and white missionaries in Africa considered his program for the emancipation of blacks too radical. For their part, the American Liberians felt that closer ties with the African would erode their power. From the last decade of the 19th century, Europeans brought the African continent under their control. School education was in the hands of missionaries and colonial administration with low standards and teachings based on the superiority of the Europeans. But some Africans were quick to react to this restrictive educational situation. Very recently, in a chapter published in the book Histories through Narrative of Education in Africa, co-edited by Hélène Villar-Rosnes, which is here, Jean-Luc Martineau, and myself, Esther Gineste, a young scholar, delves into the question of African teachers' struggle for intellectual autonomy in the first half of the 19th century. She examines how intellectuals trained in missionary schools northeast of Lake Victoria produced a vast corpus of writings in Luo, Luhaya, Swahili, Luganda, and other languages. The contents of these publications were drawn directly from local knowledge. Members of intellectual networks stretching as far as Uganda and the Indian Ocean, those African teachers used school to carve out an autonomous cultural space for themselves. Their aim was to transform into legitimate knowledge via the written word, knowledge inferiorized by the colonial power because it was relegated to orality. This aim was as much a political objective as a pedagogical one. It was intended to create meaningful communities to resist the pressure of colonialism, of segregation. Ultimately, the aim of this African literati was to give direction to a youth led astray by colonization, to help young people imagine a future free from European domination. So doing, they transformed the intellectual landscape and helped to build the cultural field of independence. But this intellectual activity has had an impact on the gendered organization of knowledge transmission. Oral knowledge was historically transmitted by the PIM. The PIM were elderly women who taught the youth about sexuality, morality, household management, as well as the history of the village, of neighboring societies, and of more distant lands. Through stories, riddles, and songs, they trained young people to become effective members of the society. These women occupied a central place in the networks of knowledge and social relations that organize society. The transition to the written word thus represented an appropriation of women's knowledge by men. However, women continued to keep PIM knowledge and mode of expression alive, notably within charismatic Christianity, literature, and girls' school. This raises the question of the relationship between education, imperialism, and gender. We now turn to Ethiopia, where the educator Sennedou Gebru worked in the 1940s and 50s as head mistress of the Impress Menen School, which trained the country's female elite. Sennedou Gebru was born in Ethiopia in 1916. She first learned to read and write in the Ethiopian national language, Amharic, in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. She then received her primary education in English at the Swedish mission in Addis Ababa. She then moved to France and Switzerland in the 20s for secondary and higher education in French. She returned to Ethiopia in 1933, 3 years before the Italian invasion. Then she joined the resistance guerrilla warfare against the occupying forces, before being arrested and deported to a prison in Italy. When Ethiopia was liberated in 1941, she became a teacher and a school principal, as well as a prolific Amharic language author of drama, poetry, and press articles. In 1957, she became the first woman elected in the Ethiopian National Parliament. As I said in my introduction, Ethiopia, although independent, was in the 1940s and 50s under strong British and US influence. This influence was very strong in the educational sector. For Sanadu Gebru, education was about the independence of the nation and the place of the woman within it. But what was her relationship with European school knowledge? First, she saw education as the new and best way to protect Ethiopia's independence. And for Ethiopia to exist by and for itself on the international stage, its youth had to receive the same education as the youth of the world's most powerful countries. What's more, Sanadu Gebru believed that Ethiopia had no reason to envy any other country. Europe's sophisticated material civilization did not make it a superior essence. For her, European knowledge had a strong instrumental value, but no superior intrinsic value. Consequently, importing did not mean imitating nor submitting. The second point, which follows on from the first, was that Sanadu Gebru was not worried about the loss of identity or lack of self-confidence that a European education could engender in Ethiopian youth. She believed that Ethiopian identity, based on centuries of written culture, was sufficiently ineradicable that European teaching would in no way alter Ethiopianness. She also ensured that the school strengthened her pupils' national feeling. For instance, she wrote plays in Amharic extolling the anti-colonial resistance against Italy. Her students performed these plays both inside and outside the school. Third, it was essential not to leave men alone with a monopoly on knowledge that was a source of power. Since schools providing European-style knowledge were the new route to public responsibility, they were an opportunity that young Ethiopian women could not afford to pass up. The feeling was one of urgency in a time perceived as constantly accelerating. As one girl student wrote in the Amharic newspaper Addis Zemen in 1951, I quote, "As time goes as fast as water flows, our country, Ethiopia, is now on a fast track. And women are left behind, either in education or in other fields. So, let's learn hard and be fruitful in following the precept, let's control time instead of being controlled by it." Knowledge was the way to control time. This quote raises a crucial gender issue. Already subjected to male domination, Ethiopian women could not afford to let men gain more power over them by monopolizing education. On the contrary, to be equal with men, they had to fight for access to knowledge and intellectual authority. This Ethiopian school principal gave priority to gender issues over those linked to Western educational imperialism. I will now draw some general conclusions and implications. Two related points. First, the notion of ambiguity can be related to that of imitation and the struggle for intellectual authority. Second, ambiguity is implied by complex relationships to European school knowledge. Thinking in terms of ambiguity means, in a way, adopting the binarities of colonial ideologies and systems. These binarities are so pervasive in thinking, including post-colonial thinking, that to emancipate oneself from them implies, paradoxically, starting from them. The pedagogues studied here lived at the crossroad of these binarities. Their positions can only be defined using contradictory terms: collaboration versus resistance, inventiveness versus constraint, legitimization versus criticism, proximity versus distance, and so on and so on. But they fit in any. I cannot help thinking of Michel de Certeau, because these African pedagogues were forced to deal with an order of knowledge imposed by colonial power. Therefore, they had to develop tactics to, I quote, escape it without leaving it. As we have to account for the variety of actions and agency of African societies to understand how they contributed to shape the colonial encounter, we need to rediscover the history of African pedagogues who have remained in the shadow. This will contribute for a history of education to find the place it deserves as a key explanatory element of colonialism. This will contribute also to the multivocal international dialogue that includes the margin of nations and empire. This is a key challenge for our post-colonial world. To conduct such study, we need to learn African languages to broaden the range of sources and rediscover the voices of Africans. Too many colleagues still consider that sources in European language suffice to study Africa. A more general remark: researchers from the global north, should take more seriously into account their position in the international division of scientific labor and put in place practices that contribute to bring more equality with African colleagues. Let me give you one example. Researchers in Europe often mention their research assistant. Many times, these assistants have positions in the academy of their country. These assistants do the interviews, select the archives in African language, and translate them into European languages. They contribute to shape the research questions, and they share their interpretation. Back home, the researcher in Europe, if kind, acknowledges the assistant in a footnote. The philosopher from Benin, Pauline Untonji, analyzed how scholars in Africa were reduced to the local and the factual, while scholars in Europe theorized in international journals. For the first, the raw material and the shadow. For the second, the finished goods and a successful career. This is the situation today, and many African colleagues are fed up to be exploited. Researchers in Europe have to do their utmost to put an end to this colonial condescension and scientific extractivism. I have come to the end of my presentation. I hope that these three examples and the implication I drew from them will resonate with you who works on other spaces and themes in the history of education. Thank you very much.
Obrigada, Pierre Guidi, por essa estimulante discussão, né? Quando você apresenta esses três exemplos de resistência e dominação da agência dos professores, né, nos espaços coloniais, mas eu agradeço especialmente pela sua pelas suas conclusões, nas quais você evidencia a desigualdade no que concerne à própria escrita da história e a desigualdade que a gente tem no campo acadêmico e científico. Agradeço muitíssimo. E, bom, gente, com isso a gente encerra as nossas conferências de encerramento, obviamente, né? E aí passamos à sessão de encerramento também. Gente. Então, live.
Gostaríamos de agradecer aos nossos palestrantes por suas valiosas contribuições e pela mediação da professora Diana Vidal. Com esta sessão, nos aproximamos do encerramento da ISCHE 45. Esta conferência foi marcada por diálogos e debates inspiradores que certamente continuarão a influenciar nossas pesquisas e práticas acadêmicas. Gostaríamos de agradecer a todas as pessoas que contribuíram para o sucesso deste evento, nossos palestrantes, moderadores, organizadores, monitores, e especialmente todos os participantes que fizeram desta 45ª conferência um momento de troca e aprendizado. Para encerrar oficialmente essa conferência, passamos a palavra para a professora Inês Dúcia, presidente da ISCHE, para suas palavras finais.
Bom, boa tarde. I will speak in English. I think everybody has. Do you still have your phone, your translation? We have translation, or should I translate? No, that's okay. Okay, it's working. So many thanks for everything. I will be very short. I am really pleased that we had this conference in Natal. I think it's very important for ISCHE to travel, to engage with different communities, as I said in the beginning. And also the theme is very important. I also feel particularly touched by Pierre's final words. We need to do much better at decolonizing our own field, our own practices, not necessarily working in other countries, but also in our countries and as an international association. I think this is very important for us. It touches ourselves very deeply. So thank you very much to all of you who have been here, to the keynotes, to the all the participants, all the panelists, everyone, all the people who have supported us. I also want to mention all the young group in black. I must say I am very jealous of all the team you have here. So nice, so warm, so hardworking. Really, that's an asset. It's not that easy, Olivia, elsewhere. So don't get spoiled because we don't get this kind of support in all the conferences we have. And I also want to say that this is a partial closing because our conference follows online. We still have 2 days, September 5 and September 6, full of panels, very interesting. If you remember my opening comments, we have 166 participants, very high. We usually have around 100 online. And I would like to particularly mention an online panel, which we wanted to have here too, but the panelists could not travel. One of them is Parimala Rao from Jawaharlal, I will say wrongly, Nehru University in India. Apologies for mispronouncing. Parimala has done extensive work on colonial education in India and has also, I think, a historiographical position of the ambiguity of that colonial education, which I think will be very interesting to hear. And also then Claudia Zapata. Claudia Zapata is from Chile, from the University of Chile, the most important university of Chile. Claudia has specialized in the history of indigenous intellectuals, Latin American intellectuals coming from indigenous communities in the 20th century. Her work is also very interesting. I strongly recommend that. And she also has a discussion about decolonialism, and also I would say an important discussion within, for example, the Latin American community of decolonial educators. I think it will be very interesting to hear them both. The modality that we have organized for this panel is that they will pre-record their videos. You know that the online, well, it's open for all of those who are registered. You just have to access ComTool and there will be the Zoom links and you can access them from wherever you are. And so we will have these pre-recorded videos and then there will be hopefully time for discussion in this case. So that's all on my side. Again, thank you very much. Thank you, Olivia. I hope that now you can relax We also have a cocktail waiting for us, and we have the tour, if you want, the catamaran, the walking tour. So this is not over, but also I hope you can also relax, and thank you for being here.
Chegamos ao final, em parte, não é? Bem, hoje é um dia de muita alegria para todos nós, porque concluímos uma parte da missão que aceitamos e que enfrentamos, que era sediar a 45ª edição da ISCHE. Para nós brasileiros, em especial para nós potiguares, é uma alegria e foi uma alegria, está sendo uma alegria recebê-los. Em especial porque durante muito tempo, talvez nós não tivéssemos sequer a condição de recebê-los. Em outros tempos, sequer tínhamos a consciência que um dia poderíamos sediar em Natal, na Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Norte, uma conferência da ISCHE. Durante outros tempos, seria impossível uma pessoa não falante do inglês, como eu, pensar em organizar uma conferência da ISCHE. Mas, como bem lembrou a Zandra, há inteligência artificial, há cruzamentos, há possibilidades de interação, e isso eu digo para vocês que é certamente uma das maiores contribuições dos últimos anos para a comunidade de historiadores da educação que não está no hemisfério norte. E isso me fortalece a pensar cada vez mais estratégias e ações para a história da educação. Isso faz com que eu e outros colegas que estão aqui, desde a iniciação científica até o pós-doutorado, possamos também interagir com pesquisadores aparentemente muito distantes, em outras épocas. E com essas palavras, eu digo que se nós hoje temos possibilidades de cruzamento, também temos possibilidades de descolonizar, ou de pensar a diversidade por outros focos e de outras formas. A ISCHE já é por si só uma conferência internacional, mas com esses aparatos que nós temos hoje, e com essa perspectiva das transmissões pelo YouTube, por exemplo, ou da conferência online, ela chega onde muitas vezes a gente não pensava que podia chegar. E certamente a palavra que mais me vem à mente agora é: conseguimos concluir a primeira parte da conferência. Conseguimos. E nós conseguimos em função dos de camisa preta, né? Acho que assim o Pierre falou, a Zandra, a Inês. Então eu queria chamar todos vocês aqui para frente, por favor. Todos os monitores desse evento, por favor, aqui na frente. Uma salva de palmas para todos eles. Eu quero dizer que são jovens, bolsistas de iniciação científica, mestrandos, doutorandos, doutores, que fizeram o melhor possível para recebê-los em Natal. Muito obrigada a todos vocês que estiveram na 45ª. Muito obrigada aos monitores que fizeram essa conferência acontecer. Destaco em especial a contribuição de Laís Paula. Por favor, Laís. A nossa secretária, assistente, vem para cá, Laís, para a gente fazer. Vem para cá. E eu, em nome de Laís, agradeço a todos os demais aqui presentes. Permaneçam aqui, por favor. Gostaria de convidar todos vocês a ficarem aqui também para fazermos uma foto geral de todos os participantes dessa conferência. Muito obrigada.
She's inviting all of us to come here and have a final picture of all of us.
Obrigada. E lembrem do nosso grito aqui, o grito de guerra. ISCHE!
Aqui. Tem que sentar algum. Aquí en el estrado. Ella es la compañía. La